so I've been playing Resident Evil Revelations 2. You know, one doesn't have to look very far to find out that the Uncharted series clearly took some inspiration from Tomb Raider, but just expanded upon everything. Then, by the time the Tomb Raider reboot happened, it seemed that Crystal Dynamics may have taken a few pointers from Uncharted. And now, people will often say that Tomb Raider kinda plays like Uncharted, whereas they used to say that Uncharted kinda played like Tomb Raider. This game has a similar thing going on, but then with The Last of Us. I mean, The Last of Us clearly couldn't have been if it wasn't for Resident Evil. Things like the buddy system, third-person shooting, and reading notes were all popularized by the Resident Evil series. And sure, some of these were already tropes to begin with, but I still find it very unlikely that The Last of Us wasn't inspired by Resident Evil, if only indirectly. Either way, Revelations 2 seems to take a lot of the changes The Last of Us made to the formula. So now a game that kinda plays like Resident Evil 4 ends up playing almost exactly like The Last of Us, if it were episodic for no other reason than the fact that The Walking Dead made a fuck ton of money. Anyway, the game stars Claire Redfield and Moira Burton, who have been kidnapped by an evil organization and taken to a deserted island where they have to do puzzles and shit. Also, Barry Jill Sandwich Burton has returned to bless us with his bearded presence once again. Only now he's pretty much Joel from The Last of Us, only then with a few more one-liners and this little girl called Natalia following him around. And together, they have to work towards finding each other and figuring out the mystery of this island. Now, if you've seen my Revelations review or my Resident Evil Dead Aim review, you'll know that I rather enjoy the RE plotlines as I quite like laughing at them. And similar to the first Revelations, this game now knows about this and it has become self-aware. Even more so than the first game actually, as there are tons of in-jokes and references.
Oh my god, are you okay?
Yeah, I was almost a Claire sandwich.
Does Barry tell everyone that story?
But despite that, the overall tone is actually a lot more serious than any of the other Resident Evil games. Well, Resident Evil 6 certainly tried to be serious as well, but this game actually almost kind of pulls it off, sort of. Thing is that Revelations 2 is atmospheric as fuck. As I said, they may very well have taken a few pages from The Last of Us, and, well, it shows. The island it's set on is supposed to be somewhere in Eastern Europe, so naturally shit looks incredibly depressing. The abandoned playgrounds, the rainy gray skies, the big flats, and the broken up asphalt really do make for a pretty cool setting if you ask me. It's just kind of a shame then that the story is still stupid as fuck and some of the writing just feels very forced and unnatural. Really, it's not even funny or campy like the other Resi games, it just seems kinda messy more than anything. For instance, at one point, Natalia tags along with Claire and Moira, but she eventually gets kidnapped by someone. Claire and Moira, however, don't seem to notice this because explosions, but they do show it to the player. After the explosions are done Michael baying around though, Moira turns around and says, "Claire, we lost the girl." As if they just instantly know what happened. They don't even call for her or anything, they don't bother to look behind the crates. I mean, if I was a little girl and I saw Michael Bay happening, I'd probably want to hide somewhere as well. And yeah, they do look for her about a chapter later, but it's still just such an awkward way of writing that scene, and it isn't the only example of where the writing just feels a tad bit rushed or unclear. Luckily though, the story is kinda thin, so it doesn't really get in the way all that much, and I still thought it was enjoyable for what it was either way. I wasn't laughing my ass off or anything, but part of the fun of playing a Resident Evil game for me is seeing what kind of crazy shit they'll come up with next. I mean, there's body horror, and then there's this. But despite Wesker's Quasimodo-looking sister, the overall tone is definitely much more reserved, especially when you're actually playing the game. Thing is that this game is all about horror, though not in a way you might expect coming from many of the other Resident Evil games. Cause unlike all Resi games up to this point, it kinda ditches most of the survival aspects in exchange for stealth. There are no bombastic action stages either, and shit only tends to get crazy during the boss fights. The vast majority of the game is just very quiet and atmospheric, and even the amount of enemies sprinkled around the levels has been severely cut back. So in that sense, it really does bear quite some similarities to The Last of Us. Although, I will admit that I wasn't really sure why people were comparing it to The Last of Us at first. I mean, I just kind of figured that people forgot how much of these things Resident Evil already did in the first place. For instance, it has the exact same upgrade system Revelations 1 had, but because it's used at a workbench now instead of an ammo crate, it's a The Last of Us style upgrade system. Or the fact that you have a little buddy tagging along, which is something that the Resident Evil series has done on and off since Resi 2. But then, when I started playing as Barry, it became pretty obvious that this game is very much inspired by The Last of Us. Thing is that it's pretty much split up into two slightly different playstyles. And as the game goes on, you'll alternate between them depending on whether or not you're playing as Claire and Moira or Barry and Natalia. The chapters playing as Claire and Moira are more focused on puzzling and seem to be the most RE4-ish of the two. But the chapters with Barry are all about stealth and tend to feature a bit more combat, though compared to RE5 and 6 it still isn't much. However, both gameplay styles do have one thing in common, and that's a feature called partner zapping. In a similar fashion to Resident Evil 0, you're able to switch to your little buddy at any given time. And you'd want to do this as both little buddies have their own unique abilities. Moira has a flashlight and a crowbar, so she's able to light up the place, blind enemies, and open up doors. And Natalia can see enemies through walls because The Last of Us, and she's able to throw bricks. Basically, the entire game is based around this mechanic. Right from the get-go, you'll have Moira trying to pry open a door while Claire holds off oncoming enemies, and you'll have Barry stabbing shit in the dick while Natalia points at walls. It all starts off relatively simple, but the game does eventually do a few clever things with it. For instance, there will be invisible enemies that only Natalia will be able to see, which for some reason was actually really quite creepy to me. And there's also a puzzle with glow-in-the-dark footprints that only Moira can see, and while this shit isn't exactly rocket science, it did spice up the gameplay enough for me to keep shit interesting. The only little niggle I have with this mechanic is that when the buddies are left to their own devices, they may or may not always do what you want them to do. Mostly Moira, whom you'll need to rely on to brighten up your day when the game gets dark. And holy shit, this game gets dark. The way that they did this is by having Moira turn to wherever you point the camera. So, in theory, she should always point the flashlight in the right direction. Except that this doesn't really work all that well in tight spaces and corridors, which is pretty much where 70% of the game takes place. Luckily though, it's not a very big deal and it usually only happens in areas where there isn't any combat. So it's not like you'll be getting any game overs on their behalf. Anyway, apart from the little buddy system, it's a pretty standard third-person horror stealthy crafty shooty game. If you've played any of the Resident Evil games since 4, or The Evil Within, and of course The Last of Us, you should already have a pretty good idea of what you're in for. So, to avoid sounding like a broken record, I'm just gonna go over what this game does differently compared to Revelations 1. And right off the bat, the biggest addition definitely being the inventory. Thing is that Revelations 1 didn't have an inventory. Sure, you picked up some items here and there, but even things like herbs never really became anything more than just a number in the corner of your screen. Now, there's I hesitate to call it old school, but in a way it kind of is, inventory system. Which might not sound like much, but if you remember how much the puzzles used to rely on combining items, then you might find that its simplification and eventual removal had a pretty big impact on the series overall. And, well, it doesn't really play into the puzzles all that much, to be honest. What the inventory does do, however, is once again allow you to combine items. Only now they've expanded upon it quite a bit. And by expanded upon it, I mean ripped off The Last of Us. So you find things like empty bottles, alcohol, rags, and all kinds of seemingly useless objects. And what you do is combine these objects to craft throwable items like Molotov cocktails and even some types of medicines to clear off the gunk of your screen. And while I do like the idea, it also makes you do a lot of inventory management. Now, I personally didn't really mind all that much, as the game isn't very action heavy and fast paced to begin with, but pausing the game to dick around in menus doesn't necessarily do wonders for the old immersion either. Thing is that a lot of the time you'll find yourself trading items between you and your partner because certain combinable items won't stack. Add that to the different kinds of ammo you'll be carrying and the throwable items, herbs, and key items, and you end up with an inventory that can be quite hard to manage at times depending on your playstyle and difficulty. Especially in co-op mode, I can already see the
"No, you carry the toilet paper"
arguments happening right before my eyes. Now, something else that kinda bothered me about this game is the overall sense of low budgetiness. I mean, I know Capcom hasn't been doing all that well the last couple of years, so it kinda makes sense, and for as far as lower texture qualities and poor lip sync go, I don't really care all that much. However, the animation is a bit stiff, and as a result, the controls can feel a bit stilted as well. Like, there's a lot of clipping going on, and since the game takes place in tight corridors, you'll see this happen more often than you probably should. At first, I kinda thought that maybe this was done on purpose, but given the fact that the game gives off a very cheap impression overall, I highly doubt it. Either way, I'd still say that, despite a few hiccups and balancing issues, the game is still pretty okay good. Similar to Revelations 1, it's far from great, but depending on what you expect from a Resident Evil game, I also wouldn't say that it's bad. If anything, it's kinda like a low-budget The Last of Us, or a stealthy Resident Evil 4, depending on how you look at it. And I was totes cool with that, yo. But if you're still hoping for the series to return to its roots, then you'll probably end up being disappointed. I mean, strictly mechanically speaking, it only strayed farther from its roots if anything, albeit in a different direction than RE6. Anyway, about half a year ago, I stated the following. It'll pander to fans, misinterpret itself, and it'll likely become a giant clusterfuck of ideas that'll barely hold together. We'll dissect it and pretend that there's more going on than Capcom just being silly, but in the end, if someone asks if we all enjoyed it, the answer will probably be a strong, I guess. And, well, having played it, I'd say that I was pretty spot on. The game has tons of good ideas and a few cool mechanics, but half of them are ripped off or reused, and they don't always gel particularly well. But on the other hand, it still has some pretty cool atmosphere, and it also has that typical Resident Evil charm. I mean, apart from all the references and Barry fucking Burton, you even end up in a mansion with music that sounds strangely familiar. I wonder what it reminds me of. Yes, Capcom. Ooh. Okay, I didn't even write that. That was just me going really weird for some reason. I apologize. Have a good day. Goodbye. Mwah.